In the last few years, there's been a lot of research that's come out about the value and the importance of integrating children and youth into the life of the worshiping community, into the life of the church. That has been in some ways a comfort to those of us who have worked in more mainline circles. We never really embraced what I call the silo model that a lot of our evangelical Protestant brothers and sisters did. In many of those churches, or in some of those churches, the way it worked is that they had a programming track, typically on Sunday morning, for every age group. So you'd show up to church, and your youngest kids would go off to the nursery, and then there was a preschool ministry, an elementary school ministry, a middle school ministry, and a high school ministry. And then everyone would kind of break off into their own groups for Sunday morning, and then at the end of the morning, they'd all come back together and go home. And that model, there was actually a lot to that model. A lot of it was talking about how that model allowed you to be really engaging with kids in ways that were age appropriate and all this kind of stuff. But what they found is that siloing it out just didn't help. What it did is it just created a bunch of kids who knew how to do church in a specific way that was specific to their age group and all this kind of stuff. So, and that research, to be honest, was really well done, and it's well documented, and I agree with it fully. And I think for those of us who have lived in mainline circles, as I said, we never really bought that model completely. In most of our churches, we expected worship to always be intergenerational. We expected that kids wouldn't go off, especially older kids, teens, wouldn't necessarily go off to quote-unquote Sunday school or something during worship. We do that a lot with younger kids. Some of that is just by necessity, right? I mean, babies kind of struggle in a quiet hour-long worship service, so we've always kind of been okay with nursery. But yet what I've seen, and what I kind of want to talk about today, is a dangerous baby in bathwater situation in which I've seen this and I don't like it, and it puts me at odds with some other people who I really respect. So, but I stand behind it. So the thing that I've read a lot in forums I'm a part of, and again, I'm talking about groups of predominantly PCUSA, mainline leaders, is that they look at this research and they say, we were right. We shouldn't do programming for kids and youth. We should just expect them to be in worship and rely on parents to do Christian education at home. And that's what I've heard a lot of, right? Like, that's kind of great. We don't have to do anything for them. And I think that's wrong. In fact, I think it's dangerously wrong. And I think in part, I don't know if this come across as too harsh, I think it's lazy on our part to just decide the next generation doesn't need anything specific to them, because some research has shown that siloing kids out is bad. Siloing kids out does not mean, in my read, never doing anything that is age appropriate. I think you've got to find ways to integrate. I think you've got to find age appropriate ways to integrate kids in. So I just want to talk about a couple ways that I think we can do that the best. I think, number one, let's be realistic and honest about what our worship services are and what they're not. Traditional Presbyterian worship, I find a lot of value in it, I enjoy leading it, is not very age appropriate for younger kids because it is predicated typically on silence. When we set up a traditional Presbyterian worship service, we typically expect that the sanctuary is going to be pretty quiet except for the person who's talking. That's not wrong, but it does make the age appropriateness a little higher entry point than, let's say, first or second grade. Pews, for example, that most of our churches have, are not conducive, by and large, to having a lot of young kids around. Now, I know you could say, well, but Brian, my kid, okay, fine, I was that kid too when I was young. But I wasn't necessarily typical in that regard. I sat still well. Not every kid does. So let's not pretend that our worship services are age appropriate for all. They're not. Now, what I am a fan of, to be clear, is I kind of like the model that a lot of our churches use, and I think it's a good model, of starting everyone in worship together at the beginning and then dismissing younger kids, and hear me say that clearly, younger kids, off to an age-specific, age-appropriate programming during worship. And here's why. If we look at what kids are good at making noise. I've got 2 kids, love them dearly. Noise is their thing, right? So think about the opening part of most of our traditional worship services. What is there? There's a lot of noise. We sing. We read together. We pray together for short periods of time. These are all things that developmentally are perfectly appropriate for young kids, right? If a kid makes a lot of noise during the call to worship, who cares? They're not actually going to be heard. If they make a lot of noise, or if they get ahead or behind, or if they don't read during the prayer confession, Who cares? It's not going to be distracting to other people. People aren't going to notice, right? Those opening parts of most traditional Presbyterian worship are great. So I would never be a fan of saying, look, let's just have kids go to their own worship or their own program right away and not be in worship at all. I think that's foolish. So I think that's the first thing, right? I think there are parts of worship that we can integrate kids into well, and I think that we should do that. I think the second thing we need to really think about is, do we design 11 o'clock worship for mid and upper elementary and middle school, high school kids to be in? And here's some of the things. Our word choice. Do we write prayers of confession that apply to a kid in middle school or a kid in upper elementary school? I'm actually not sure we do. I was looking at some of the prayers of confession that I typically write. I don't actually think they're that good when it comes to involving middle school kids or upper elementary school kids. I use big words, right? I use things that aren't real kid-friendly. So I think we need to be really careful about the language that we use when we write liturgy if we're expecting kids to be there. Let's use words that they can read. Let's find ways that we can make that part of the worship service specifically the most friendly. And I think the other thing is that in our sermons, right, are we using illustrations that tap into the life of a student? I try as much as I can, and I'm not perfect at this, about always including an illustration from school. So if you're doing an illustration about how it can be hard to get along with others, one of the examples I would encourage people to use is, talk about neighbors, talk about people at work, and talk about people at school. And say, for those of you who are in school and who are going to school tomorrow morning, you're going to get there, and there's a kid in your class who you just can't stand. Those little checkpoints engage kids into what's going on in the sermon, I think, in a better way than just kind of expecting them to sit there. So two things, language we use and the sermons that we preach. Are we being intentional to design sermons that are engaging, that could be understood by a kid in upper elementary and middle school? Now, do I think you need to dumb sermons down? No. But I think, again, the examples you use and the language you use matters. I always write sermons so that somebody in 8th grade should be able to understand them. That's not dumbing it down. It's just not using big words. It's not using fancy language. It's using illustrations that they can understand. 8th graders are developing adult minds. We can expect them to think like adults. I think the last thing when it comes to integrating kids well into worship is to think critically about the roles that we give them. I really had no part in this, so I'm not going to claim much credit for it. But the church I served, we had a youth Sunday, as a lot of churches do, and it was great. It was a great celebration. The kid preached. But one of the things that we did, and I don't know how this happened, but it wasn't my idea, somebody else on our staff or one of our volunteers, who got the idea to have our youth praise band lead worship at our contemporary service on a regular basis, I think every other month. Now again, I'm not taking credit for that. I didn't think of it. But it was a great move because it proved that it wasn't just Youth Sunday that they could lead. It was every Sunday. It was every week. Those kids had a chance to lead the whole worship service, play the music, pick the music for the whole thing. That was great. Talk about validating their role and saying, look, you're as capable of leading adults in worship as the regular band is. I pulpit supplied for a church a month ago who every single Sunday, and this I did not do. It was not my church, not my idea. Every single Sunday, one of their readers is a kid. That takes effort, planning, prioritization, but it was big. This girl, early elementary, mid-elementary, second, third grade, I think, led the prayer of confession. And therefore, the language had to be such that it could be read by a kid of that age. So I think three things. I think one, a lot of it revolves around language, making sure that we're using language in our liturgy, a prayer of confession, things like that, that kids can read well and can understand well. Number two, structuring our sermons so that they're age appropriate for kids of that age, making sure that we use illustrations and examples that they can engage with. And number three, I think making sure that when possible, we give kids substantial roles in leading worship. All those things can go a long way toward, I think, integrating kids well into worship. So if you got thoughts or comments, please reply. I'd love to engage more, but there's just a couple of my thoughts about how we can best integrate kids into the life of our worshiping communities.